welcome to the Week in Review. And this past week, we've seen signs of more relaxation regarding the restrictions around COVID-19. And we're going to talk around that and the fact that some people feel that we're still looking at the wrong things and debating the wrong matters, and what the implications could be there and where we should be looking. And that's one issue. But of course, we can't ignore the whole lot of arrests that happened this past week of various people regarded as part of or alleged to be part of state capture and their followers. So we'll be having a brief discussion on that as well. So stay tuned for that. But in the first place, I'd like to welcome our guest this afternoon, is Professor Steven Friedman. He is from the University of Johannesburg, Faculty of Humanities, and a well-known political and social commentator. And also, as usual, Dr. Piet Krokamp from the Northwest University, also on the program. But Steven, if we can start with you, because you wrote a very interesting commentary earlier this week about COVID-19 and the fact that you can't fight COVID-19 if you keep on debating or ignoring the real issues. Maybe we should start there, because I mean, we've seen the whole uproar around and conspiracy theories, I think we can call them, around the state's COVID-19 app the tracing app that they've introduced, and a variety of issues around that. So maybe that's a good place to start.
Yeah, thanks, Cobus. Yeah, look, the point I was trying to make there, which I've made elsewhere, is that the one thing we do not debate about COVID-19 in this country is how to stop it. We have these endless debates about lockdown regulations, which, as you point out, have just been eased. You take the example of the app, in which we have this debate about, does it infringe your freedom or doesn't it? But the one thing we never debate is how to make sure that as few people as possible actually get the virus. And this is no surprise, because right at the beginning, when COVID-19 arrived in this country, the government's chief scientific advisor said publicly that a severe epidemic was inevitable because no country had avoided a severe epidemic. Now, first of all, once you start off by saying that a severe epidemic is inevitable, it probably is inevitable because you don't take the precautions you need to take to stop it happening. And secondly, it simply wasn't true to say that no country can avoid it. I could reel off a list of countries which have avoided it. But more importantly, as we sit here and talk today, South Africa, which has the most advanced health system on the African continent, has as many COVID-19 deaths and cases as the rest of the continent combined. So that is the consequence of taking that attitude. We never debated that. We never had a serious discussion about that. We simply had this debate about the lockdown rules. And besides the fact that may have put lives at risk, the great irony of this is that most of the people who are debating the lockdown rules seem to think that the future of the economy depends on the lockdown rules. Well, actually, the future of the economy does not depend on the lockdown rules. The immediate future of the economy depends on beating COVID-19, because we're not going to have a normal economy as long as thousands of people are getting sick and some people are passing away. So it's a great irony that the people who wanted to save the economy don't want to talk about how we save the economy. In the midst of the pandemic in this country, it was reported that one of the reasons we were not fighting it properly is that the testing laboratories weren't working. But instead of people demanding that the testing laboratories work, everybody ignored that and carried on fighting about the lockdown.
What would be, because we're at a point now where we're talking about relaxing the lockdown even further. And if what you're saying is true, we could also eventually, like somebody said earlier today, by March, be back where some countries in Europe are right now by having to, bring back the lockdown again, which is also something we don't want.
Well, Cobus, the situation at the moment, which, I find it odd that it's assumed that in South Africa, as we speak today, the problem's gone away. That we have these rapidly decreases. Last night's figures were in the region of 1,800, 1,900 cases in one day. If they have that in South Korea or Rwanda or Tunisia, they would declare a lockdown for 6 weeks. We regard that as not a problem. And you go to public places in the city, and people are behaving as though there's no problem. So, it's not only that we may go back to those figures which we had in June and July, it's that the figures we have at the moment will not allow the economy to operate in the way that it should. So, what do we have to do? We have to start talking about the real issues. How do we get testing and tracing to work? How do we introduce restrictions which inconvenience people as little as possible, but actually isolate people who have the virus? And how do we ensure that people stick by the rules? Because, if you have, just anecdotally, as we say as academics, I walked into to buy some bread into a restaurant stroke bakery in the suburbs, and it was chock full of people sitting at tables packed next to each other without masks on. Well, you don't need me to tell you where that might lead. So I think that we need to start as a society taking seriously this discussion about how do we make sure that we start following the example of those countries who virtually eliminated the virus, many of which have social profiles like ours. If you go to Asia, for example, Thailand is not nearly as rich as South Korea, for example. They don't even wear masks in Thailand anymore, not because they're not careful, because there are no cases. So you don't have to wear. That's what we should be aiming for. We're a long way from that now, but the good news about COVID around the world is that if countries really want to turn it around, we're nowhere near the kind of level where you turn it around. So it's still not too late.
What would your suggestion be if you say we've got to tackle this thing now again? And looking at the one side, on the other side, you've got clamor from tourism and a lot of other people who are collapsing, closing down businesses. Where's that middle way of finding a solution here?
Look, I think, if you have, I am simply not convinced. And we're seeing evidence from around the world. You're talking about hospitality, you're talking about tourism. I'm not convinced that those activities are really going to get back to anything vaguely like normal until you have a massive drop in cases and fatalities. Because, you can open places up, but people are nervous to go to those places. So I think, if you can get testing and tracing right, then a lot of the other things falls into place. South Korea didn't have very strict lockdown measures. They had some, they didn't have, but they got testing and tracing 100% correct. So that's the challenge. If we can get testing and tracing good enough so that we can isolate the cases, we can make sure that those who contract the disease don't hand it on to other people, then all sorts of things become possible. But as long as we stick where we are now, where I was told the other day by somebody in the profession that we don't even know what our infection rates are. If you want to know how you're doing in relation to COVID-19, there's something called the R number, which sounds terribly technical, but it basically tells you how many people are infected by each person who has the virus. We don't even know what our R number is because the testing and tracing is so weak. So, as long as that's the reality, you can open up everything tomorrow. And as you correctly say, in a few weeks' time or a couple of months' time, you'll go back to the same dilemmas that we've had before about, whether we're going to let people die or we're going to try and save the economy. If you want to get out of that trap for good, you've got to get testing and tracing right.
Stephen, if I may ask you something, it's being said recently, so that 80% of South African cases might be asymptomatic, but asymptomatic people still transmit the virus. How much tracing can you really do, and testing can you really do if 80% of your people don't even know that they have it? Is that number not too high for us to really get a grip on tracing and testing and tracing?
Well, look, nobody knows how many asymptomatic people there are. There are scientific theories around the world. But what we know, what is proven from experiences around the world, is that if you're able to the known cases, in other words, the symptomatic cases, and you trace their contacts and you isolate the contacts, then you get infection rates rapidly down. So COVID-19 is 6 months old. Scientific theories including the one about asymptomatic people, are changing all the time. But what we can do in a situation like that is we can look around the world and we can see what works and what doesn't work. And every society which has been able to get COVID-19 down to such a low level that you can go back to normal has done it through testing and tracing.
It's being said that there are two reasons why some countries do get it under control. The one is if you have a, say, authoritarian type of state, like say China, or the other if you have a highly compliant society. In other words, you make the rules and they comply with the rules, and you don't have to use any form of coercion. And sometimes people say that we fall somewhere there in the middle. We don't have a very compliant society, not because they don't like laws, but because they simply economically, for instance, can't afford to comply with laws sometimes. So we have a different type of sociology, and therefore this control that you talk of might always be complicated by that matter. Does it make sense, or is it a frivolous argument sometimes?
No, it's not a frivolous argument. I think it's part of the story. I think one of the reasons why there's stuff about that we don't fully understand. One of the reasons why we're doing about worse than every other country on the continent, only some of whom, Tunisia has effective test and trace. Rwanda's done quite well at it. But the reason why is because we are the strange hybrid society. One of the consequences of that is, why have, besides the political leadership issues, which we know very well, why has Western Europe and America done so badly at this? The answer is because they rely on curative medicine. The whole system is built around state-of-the-art medicine which cure you. But curative medicine is not all that effective if there's no cure. So what you do in countries where you don't rely on curative medicine is you rely on public health measures and you rely on preventive medicine. We're somehow in the middle here. The other thing we're in the middle on, and there's a political dimension here, and that's where your point becomes very relevant, is that I think a very important part of the story in South Africa is that we've got a governing party which doesn't trust most of the people who vote for it. And that's why we've had some of the restrictions we've had. And that's why the scientists say that it's inevitable to have a severe epidemic. They don't mean it's inevitable everywhere. They mean it's inevitable here. Now, I don't believe it is inevitable here. I think they gave up at the beginning. But obviously, if you're going to have a strategy here, it must take that into account. And one of the things the government did not do here, which could have made a huge difference, is it didn't go out to the townships and shack settlements and try to work with people. There's a state in India called Kerala, which has very similar poverty levels to ours. And in Kerala, they've had very low numbers of cases and very low numbers of infections because if the government heard at the beginning of the epidemic that people weren't comfortable about the regulations, they went out and they spoke to them about it and they sent people out. And that hasn't been done here. So if you've got a society where you've got these complicated compliance issues, etc., the only way you can do it to a certain extent is that you have to go out to people and talk to them. And if you don't trust your constituency, if you ban cigarettes because you say people in townships share cigarettes, if you ban alcohol because you say people in townships don't know how to use it properly, then you're going to have what we have. So I don't think I think those factors you mentioned are important, but I think they're part of what we have to take into account to actually deal with the virus. I don't think it means we must give up and say it can't be done here.
I think what to me is a complicating factor, I don't know how widespread it is, but I've spoken to a number of doctors lately, this past week, 3 of them, who had the view that all this is just over the top. It's been too much. There's been an overreaction. This whole lockdown thing was unnecessary. So you have that as well. And it's difficult if medical doctors are saying that, then you can imagine that they're going to have an influence on the people they see, and that spreads as well.
Well, that is a problem. I mean, you can't, this is a democracy and will hopefully remain a democracy. You can't tell medical doctors what they tell their patients. I don't think that this is a medical view. I think it's a view of, one can assume that that doctor who you've been speaking to, or those doctors you've been speaking to, have not had to deal with a whole lot of COVID patients who are seriously ill. Because if they were, they'd be a lot more stressed out about the virus than they really are. But yes, it is a problem that not only them, but others spread these messages. And the messages simply are not true. Some of the medical profession has been, to a certain extent, part of the problem in this country. It's the medical profession which have been saying the things that you've just related. It's the medical profession which have been saying we just have to accept that we're going to have a lot of people dying. And one of the arguments which is being made is that people die every year, so it's not a big deal. Well, as you probably know, the Medical Research Council in this country measures what they call excess deaths, which is you compare the number of deaths every year for the last 5 years, and then you see how many deaths you've had this year. We have had in the region of 40,000 excess deaths. So in other words, 40,000 people, not all of them have died from COVID probably, but we have 40,000 people who've died of natural causes this year, who probably would not have died with that if there was no COVID. Now, I don't see how you can regard that as trivial. It's
But Mike,
it's not,
I think Mike Schuster has an interesting argument about this. He says that we know that suicides are up. We know that people with cancer didn't get their treatment. In fact, the number of visits to doctors have declined by something like 50-60%. So he says it makes sense that if you neglect to some degree other diseases and illnesses in society, that you will have a rapid increase in excess deaths. So he also says, yes, some other deaths are COVID related, but you have to quantify now other deaths that exist because of the neglect of the presence of COVID. The interesting point that he makes is then we don't quantify the people that die as a consequence of the regulations. For instance, it is well possible that in a year's time we will see that the infant mortality rate during these months of COVID has increased exponentially. So his argument is it's not a matter of life versus death, it is a matter of life versus lives. In other words, people are dying, or more people might even be dying because of the medicine, the treatment, the regulations that we install, as opposed to of COVID deaths alone.
Yeah, but there's two answers to that. First of all, just to take one red herring off the table, the suicide argument doesn't hold at all, because these are very specifically natural deaths. They take out the non-natural death. Nothing natural about suicide. So let's take the argument that people are not going for treatments. Yes, as I said in the beginning, that's part of the factor. But that's going to be the case whether you have regulations or not. Let me personalize this for a moment, okay? I mean, one of the reasons I'm so careful about COVID is I have certain underlying conditions. I haven't been physically to my doctor this year. That's not because of regulations. It's because I'm scared to go. And people are going to be scared to go whether there are regulations or not. So that's got nothing to do with the regulations. That's got to do with the reality that as long as you have this virus circulating, you're going to have the consequences that you're describing. The government can pass whatever rules it likes. I'm not going to go and see my doctors until I feel comfortable. And it so happens that a couple of my doctors have said to me, "You're mad to come in, because why do you want to take the risk?" So, I don't think that really holds as an argument for not taking protective measures, because people are going to be scared, whatever you do. And of course, that is so in any country. I mean, in any country I can think of, regardless of how strict your regulations are.
Let me just ask you one question. What are the chances that we have about 16,000 deaths in South Africa due to COVID? What are the chances that more people died because of the way that we managed the presence of COVID? In other words, infant mortality rates might have gone up, TB people not getting their medicines, etc. What are the chances that the increase in poverty, and this massive increase in poverty, might actually translate into a large number of deaths, even larger than the 16,000 that we have?
Well, I mean, poverty is a serious problem. I'm not sure it's going to lead to 40,000 excess deaths in a few months. The point is that, nobody is, first of all, let me say something about the 16,000 deaths. Nobody in the profession believes that there are really 16,000 deaths. There are far more than 16,000 deaths. We just don't know how many we are. Those 16,000 deaths you're talking about, every single one of them, that's how the system works, is somebody who has tested positive for COVID. Okay. So the debate in the medical profession and allied professions is how many people died of COVID who were not tested. And that's where the debate about the excess deaths come in. So some people say, well, it's 90% of that 40,000, and some people say it's 10% or whatever. This is a debate that's going on at the moment. But there is no serious debate about the 16,000. The 16,000 have all tested for COVID within a period of a couple of weeks before they fell seriously ill, etc. So, really, it goes back to the answer I gave to the previous question. You might want to argue that most of the excess deaths are caused by things other than COVID, but you can't really argue that the 16,000. And incidentally, in all the comparative work I do, and because I'm writing a book on this at the moment, when I compare that to other countries, etc., I only use the official figures, despite the fact that they do have limitations, because it's obviously, as you will know well, we like to prepare, it's safe to compare like to like, rather than making speculative assumptions about what you prepare to compare, etc. So there's no doubt that we've had at least 16,000, but the debate is about how many more than 16,000 we've had.
Okay.
One other aspect that, and then maybe we can come to the end of this part, but another aspect that's been interesting is how it seems to me people's reaction to the regulations, the lockdown, especially at the beginning, but still today, has also been dictated by political persuasions. It would seem that, and I think we saw it in America as well, depending on where you stand on the political spectrum, often decided what your reaction would be to wearing a mask, keeping social distance, and obeying all those new restrictions.
Yes, I think that's true to a certain extent, although I think that in South Africa, that is certainly relevant in South Africa, but there's also a bit of, where you sit is where you stand in South Africa. Experiences are, dictate the way you feel about it. It's one of my bugbears, but I think that we always need to remember in all the conversations we have about public opinion in South Africa, is that most people are not part of the conversation. the opinions of most people are not taken seriously. I mean, we had a massive debate in this country about land expropriation without compensation. The only people who had no say in the debate at all were landless people. They were ignored by both sides. And it's much the same with COVID. You know, you hear all sorts of things about people in townships and shack settlements, and the only people you never hear are the people from townships and shack settlements themselves. And that is by way of saying that I think that I mean, my sense, anyway, I know the virus affects everybody. I know of people in suburbs who've got ill. I know of people in suburbs who've passed away. But my sense is that it hasn't affected the suburbs as badly as the townships and the shack settlements. And quite frankly, I base that on the nature of the debate. Because if it had been ripping through the suburbs in the way that it's ripping through parts of townships and shack settlements, then people wouldn't be taking these attitudes. People would be saying, well, you know, this is a major national crisis which we have to deal with. So yes, you're right. It does depend on political persuasions. And of course, in places like the US, you get this bizarre thing where people don't seem to mind the fact that there are huge infection rates in their states because of their politics. But here, I think it's also, as I say, depends on where you sit. I mean, just as an aside, I mean, I think that, you know, I don't have a survey to back this up, but many people in townships and shack settlements are terrified to get into taxis. And they're terrified because, I mean, not only because there have been safety issues with taxis, but also because they believe that they'll contract COVID if they're at risk, and they're right. But they have to get into taxis because they can't earn a living if they don't get into the taxis. And we haven't even discussed that issue. You know, how do you try to make sure that, you know, the basic reality for most South Africans, who we don't hear in the discussion, is how do I feed my family and keep all of us alive at the same time? And I'm afraid that's the discussion we're not having.
Well, that's another discussion I think we'll have to take even further in this program. And I'm sure, well, I hope that it'll be taken further elsewhere too. Another issue for this week, we're getting close to the end of our program. So let's just have a look at Richard Ngluli's in jail. We've had a whole swathe of people arrested, especially in connection with the asbestos roofing scandal and scam. It would seem that at last what people have been asking for, the wheel has now turned far enough that we can actually see serious action being taken.
I think the president has been saying for 3 years that he would like to strengthen the institutions of the state, and that whatever happens about corruption must come about as the natural consequences of the state just doing its work. And I think we see some of that now. I'm really curious what Steven thinks, what consequences this will have for President Ramaphosa in the next year or two, or perhaps even more immediate. Because it looks like you might reach a point where 1 or 2 cabinet ministers are being arrested, or might reach a point where somebody in the Tulia House are being arrested. And that will have consequences, one can assume, for President Ramaphosa's position, was because he's central to this idea of the cleanup of the state. I haven't seen any of the other ministers necessarily buying into that narrative as strongly as he does. Well, perhaps with the exception of Tito Mboweni. But Stephen, what do you think is the consequences if this will keep on rolling? What is the consequences for Ramaphosa?
Yeah, just before I answer that, just to say I agree with you entirely about I think your analysis is right, because I think a lot of complaining over the last couple of years has ignored the fact that Ramaphosa's strategy has been, you know, which as a student of politics, is a strategy I would support, to say, you know, you're trying to strengthen the institutions. And one of the ways you strengthen the institutions is you make sure that professional people are in those jobs and you don't tell them what to do. So it's a bit ironic that over the last couple of years, we've had people saying, well, why doesn't he tell the NPA to speed up? Well, we had a president who used to give the NPA instructions, and that didn't work very well. So I agree with you on that. What were the effects on him be? I mean, obviously, you know, I think everybody knew that once you got to this stage, and I think it's pretty clear that what we saw over the last few days is not nearly the end of it, because that's how you do tackle something like this strategically. You go for the winnable cases and then you build upwards. That it creates danger points for Ramaphosa, which haven't been there for the last while or so. So the other side, if you like, begins to fight back. So he obviously has to be cautious about that. But certainly at this stage of the game, and the fight back has begun already, he does seem to be very firmly in control, because you'll be aware that, a few days ago, there was a National Executive Committee meeting at the ANC, and there was a lot of stuff in the media beforehand. Zuma wrote him this angry letter saying, "You're betraying the ANC," etc., that there'd be a huge backlash there. And despite the fact that Zuma was sitting in the room, presumably trying to stoke it up, it didn't happen. And that tells me that right now Ramaphosa is in charge. I think the plus that he's got is, obviously, whether it's at local level or above that, there are going to be people kicking back against us because they're losing posts, they're in danger of going to jail, etc. But of course, for every person who's losing a post as a result of this, there's another person who's going to be getting a post in their place. And I think that in terms of votes within the ANC, that could well see him through, because you can always appeal for the support of the people for whom opportunities are opening up, because the people who are going to jail or the people who are going to trial are leaving gaps which enable others to fill. So, I think he's going to be in a more risky position. But I assume that, people have foreseen this over the last couple of years. And it does seem to me that he does, if he plays his cards right, he does have enough support from people who are going to benefit from this to be able to outweigh that of the people who are going to lose out.
Are you worried by reports that senior Defence Force officers have been invited to talk to certain senior people in the ANC, and apparently they're now there's talk about them going to Luthuli House to speak to the top six?
Well, I think if that started to snowball, if it started to develop, I think we should be worried. It's we've had all sorts of things happen in this country over the last 100 years, but the one thing that we've been fortunate about is that whatever happened under apartheid, the civilians controlled the military. And whatever may have happened in the ANC's fight against apartheid, the civilians controlled and Isizwe. And I think it's very important for this country to keep it that way. At the moment, I'm not very worried, because it does seem to be a couple of individuals, and there have been very clear messages from people in authority to say this is not acceptable. But obviously, I think we have to do whatever we can to encourage those who are saying, look, this is just not acceptable. And I have been encouraged by the fact that the message which is being going out is that, it doesn't matter which side you claim you're on. It doesn't matter whether you claim you're on the good guy side or the bad guy side. You just stay out. It's none of your business. And I think that's the line which needs to be held on this. And so far, it does seem to be the line which is being held.
Pete?
Yeah, I'm slightly curious about one more thing, and that is that once this process of arresting people filters through to the provinces, we know that the provincial executive committees of the ANC are rather strong, and they are, to some degree, take responsibility for the people that arrive at the elective conference, leadership conference, for instance. And I think that maybe if there's a shift of power in KwaZulu-Natal or in Gauteng or in Limpopo in the Northwest at the level of the PEC, I'll be very curious to see what comes up, what happens if there's a National General Council meeting or there's a leadership contest. What is it, in 2 years, Steven? Something like that. To what extent, if this process filters through to the provinces, it will have consequences for what's happening at the leadership conference?
Well, it will, obviously, but let's bear in mind two things. And I'm not being Pollyanna-ish about it. I'm just saying let's have a let's look at both sides of the story. First of all, I don't know of any province in the ANC which isn't split down, deeply divided, let's put it that way. So if these things start happening, we can name the provinces where there's going to be a fight back. But at the same time, in those provinces, there are also going to be people on the other side of the fence. And that takes me to the second issue. I don't think we pay nearly, I tried to do this, but I don't think we pay nearly enough attention to by-elections in this country, because they do tell us which way political winds are blowing and which way voters are going. Because of COVID, we haven't had by-elections for a few months, but they're resuming in a few weeks. And I think that if sorry?
The 11th of November.
Yeah, correct. In the 11th of November is correct, yeah. So, and incidentally, the 11th of November is really worth watching because, all the by-elections which were supposed to happen in the last 6 months are happening then. It's going to, there are going to be hundreds of by-elections around the country. If, as has happened over the last few years, if, for example, you start getting messages in particular provinces that people are unhappy with the ANC, that has a significant effect on the way this turns out. Because one of the reasons why you have a new leadership in Northwest, for example, is that, as you will recall, the ANC did terribly in Northwest in the 2016 local elections, and they had to put in a new leadership to cope with that. So yes, you're right that there will be a provincial fight back. I'm simply alerting us to the fact that A, there are people on both sides of the fence, and B, that voters are going to have a say in this as well. The last round of by-elections, the last few months of by-elections we had before COVID, for example, the one place in the country where the ANC was in serious trouble was in Mpumalanga. And that tells you something about Didi Mabuza and about things that might be happening in Mpumalanga at the moment. So if you have a similar sort of a trend in some of the other provinces, then it may well make life difficult for the fight back people as well.
And that was Professor Steven Friedman from UJ. Steven, thanks so much for taking part today. And Piet Krookamp, Northwest University, as usual, thanks. And my name's Cobus Bester. I'll be back next Sunday, 5 o'clock. Bye-bye.